My guest tonight is Dr. James Tracy. He's an associate professor at Florida Atlantic University, where he teaches courses that focus on the relationship between commercial and alternative media and socio-political issues. He's been an affiliate of Project Censored and is a regular contributor to Global Research. Professor Tracy is the host of Real Politic, a weekly program carried on Truth Frequency Radio. He also hosts the Memory Hole blog. Dr. Tracy, how are you tonight?
Oh, fine, thanks. Thank you for having me, Tim.
Well, thank you for coming on. Is there anything you want to add to the introduction?
I think that you've pretty much covered all of the bases. The weekly interview program is, I guess, fashioned along the lines of what you do. And yes, it's on Truth Frequency Radio. And then it is, it's also archived at memoryholeblog.com. Actually, there's a website, auxiliary website, checking it out, and the RSS feed is on there, but you can find the past episodes.
And the Memory Hole blog features your material as well as others that you find appropriate or important enough to post on there, correct?
Yeah, there's, I try to have a post every day, every other day or so. And originally it was, solely for my work. Now there are others, now and again that send me material. And if I deem it appropriate, then I put it on there. There's also an auxiliary website, scoopfeed.net, and I put stuff on there. And there's an RSS feed on the Memory Hole blog to the Scoop feed, and I have 4 or 5. In many cases, they're just news stories or they're links to news stories that I think are especially interesting or relevant or maybe of interest to the readers of Memory Hole blog.
And the website is at memoryholeblog.com or?
Yeah, you can find everything there.
Okay. Okay, well, tonight I have you on to talk about an article that you wrote not too long ago, a few days ago, that was featured on Global Research. The CIA and the media, 50 facts the world needs to know. And in there, you kind of discuss journalism, and you write how we generally think of journalism, or the traditional way to think of journalism as a group of intrepid reporters and journalists gathering information and investigating stories to inform the public so democracy works. But in that article, you detail why that's a myth, and there's a close relationship between established journalism, newspapers, electronic media and such, and the intelligence agencies and government in general. Do you want to get into that, and why is that a problem?
Well, it's a stark contradiction to what we are taught in civics class. If you are fortunate enough to have gone to a grade school that still teaches civics, or the sort of myth that surrounds journalism that is typically preached in journalism schools and media studies and communication studies department, this idea that the U.S. has this fourth estate. When I was doing my graduate work at University of Iowa, I did it at a graduate school of, School of Journalism, and for undergraduates and graduate students. One of the reasons I went there is because there is a particular professor, an intellectual historian, Hanno Hart, who I wanted to work with, and he was sort of the black sheep in that school. He was a Marxist, actually, more or less, and he sort of looked down his nose. He's also originally from Germany. He was kind of an emigre. And he sort of looked down his nose at this whole, fourth estate myth, and at his colleagues, many of whom themselves were retired journalists. He was as well, but he spent much less time in the industry. It's not as if he retired into academia, as some of them, in fact, did. But he was looking at it from kind of a leftist perspective, and that is kind of how I cut my teeth. Looking at journalism, at news media critically from that sort of perspective. I've kind of broken from that to a significant degree, but I still think that there are a great many blind spots that media and journalism historians, and historians more broadly, conventional historians, people who pride themselves in being members of the American Historical Society, the American Historians Association, things like that write our history, that are esteemed, that are looked up to for their, diligent archival work, and may have many book titles to their name. The CIA is something they will not look at. They will not really consider in most instances, particularly if you are considering the relationship between the CIA and the news media, the CIA and the entertainment industry to a lesser degree, but especially the news media, that's something that really tends to hit a bone and a raw nerve, I guess I should say. And that's something that's that I'm discovering now, actually, because the article that you referenced that I wrote a couple of weeks ago is based upon research I've been doing for the past few years. And I've had some difficulty actually getting it in print. And in the past, it's never been a problem sending material into to a journal and getting it published. I was specifically researching work, the historical phenomenon of Jim Garrison and his investigation into the JFK assassination. And here's this individual, of course, who was the story was dramatized in Oliver Stone's film JFK. So most people, in fact, are familiar with it. But I wanted to go back and look at how Garrison was constructed, how he was presented and framed in the U.S. News media. And it's very difficult to actually look at that problem without an historical context. At least that's the way that I approach much of my work. There has to be this sort of basis for the reader to understand it more so. And when I delved into the literature, the scholarly work, there's almost nothing there. From media scholars or conventional historians, social scientists or anything, looking at that particular episode, or really much of anything having to do with the JFK assassination in the press. Much of what you see is written by independent journalists, JFK assassination researchers. Of course, the conventional news media would disparagingly call them, assassination buffs, JFK or RFK or MLK assassination buffs. But they're researchers. A lot of their work, like Jim DiEugenio, Lisa Peace, William Davey, who I cite in the article, they've done extraordinary research into this area, and also, and I've attempted to reference their work as well as a number of other historians and journalists who've looked at Garrison and that whole episode in the 1960s and the CIA and the media relationship between intelligence and the media, and just highlight those. So it's really just an overview. But I found myself really having to rely on and having to cite some of the work of these authors in order to provide the historical context. And I think that in part is why some of the journals that I was sending the work to were saying, oh, well, these people are not bona fide academics, what have you. And of course, there's also all the baggage that comes with the JFK assassination, with Jim Garrison himself, who I believe actually is an American hero. And the rendering of his contribution and his attempt to actually get to the bottom of that particular event is something that was chronicled quite accurately by Oliver Stone back in the early 1990s with that film. But it's amazing how conventional historians that do seek to actually address these deep events, with a few exceptions, like Peter Dale Scott, who is an academic as well. Many of them actually will cite somewhat questionable sources. They will twist the truth in order to actually satisfy the editors of the given publishing house that they have a contract with, or their peers, the reviewers for that particular house, many of which university presses. So I just found this to be really amazing and very frustrating, and so that's what I'm kind of grappling with in this particular essay. And again, it's something that the subject matter is not really addressed or grappled with to the extent that it should be. I think in part that may have to do with the infiltration of the academy by intelligence agencies or parties that are favorable towards them or are also reluctant to take on this area of research because they themselves fear being called a conspiracy theorist. We can get into that, of course. That whole term is something that was devised by the CIA as a means of psychological warfare on the American people. There are few exceptions. In 2009 or 2010, Mark Crispin Miller, who's a media studies professor at New York University, actually had a book in the works called The CIA and the Media, which was going to be an edited volume, and that's apparently on the back burner with him. I touched base with him briefly, and he said he's still working on it, but it's not anything that he's brought out. But I think it was under contract at one point because I had it pre-ordered and it never came out. But I think he was going to base it in part on Bernstein's essay, which I cite a number of times in this essay.
That was in 1977, right? When Bernstein wrote that article.
Bernstein's essay was in 1977, but I think this edited volume that Professor Miller was working on was slated to be released in 2010 or 2011, and then it was just put on the back burner. And I don't exactly know why. I didn't inquire to that degree with him. He just said it was something that he is still working on. But it's disappointing it's not out there because we really need a resource like that. This is a very important topic, and that's in part why I titled the article as I did, 50 Facts the World Needs to Know. We really do need to know this information. The American public needs to be more aware than it in fact is in terms of the extent to which the information, the news that it receives on a regular basis is massaged, in some cases is overtly manipulated, in some cases may very well be constructed. Most of the public knows of the questions that I've raised about events like the Boston Marathon bombing and the Sandy Hook massacre and various other things that the news coverage does a very poor job at, to say the least. Doesn't ask the right questions, but this history causes us to have deeper questions in terms of are the news media actually playing an active role in presenting some of these narratives? The most recent of which is, the reporter's apparent shooting in Virginia last month in August, and we could point to a number of others that deserve scrutiny, to say the least. So that, in a nutshell, is an overview of the article and kind of what brought me to it. It's some of the work that I have been delving into over the past few years. It's not anything that I just sat down and wrote over the course of a few weeks or something.
Yeah, it seems a lot of effort was put into it, and it is an excellent piece. It's a great, just a condensed, version of this history, and it gives you point by point these examples. And if you go through it, and you realize how far it goes back, because we're not just talking about the CIA in 1947 and Operation Mockingbird, and we'll get into that. But as you write in the articles, this dates back at least as far back to the Woodrow Wilson administration and this group called the Inquiry, and Walter Lippmann, who worked for the Creel Committee, I believe. And that was the Office of Public Information or something, or War Information, or I forget what the official title of that was. But basically, it was involved in manipulating information, which means the media, at least as it existed back then, back then it was print media, for the purposes of achieving some sort of political objective, which then would have been entry into the war and prosecuting the war. Mm-hmm. And that goes way back. So Walter Lippmann became a big columnist. What was it, for the New York Times?
For the Washington Post.
Washington Post, I'm sorry. Yeah. And, of course, the Washington Post's history was, as you write in the articles, its ascendancy was largely, I guess, aided by the intelligence agencies because of the Philip Graham's relationship with Frank Wisner, correct?
Yeah, that paper had the most intimate ties to the CIA. Mm-hmm. Because Philip Graham, the publisher, yes, was close acquaintance of Frank Wisner, who began the office he began in the OSS as a staff member, the Office of Policy Coordination, and this was actually in the aftermath of the war. And a lot of people don't realize the fact that this became the quickest growing unit within what would eventually become the Central Intelligence Agency in 1948. And I point out in the essay that it rose in personnel by almost 10 times from 1949 to 1952, from around 300 to close to 3,000 individuals who were involved in the OPC, which sounds like a pretty benign title, the Office of Policy Coordination, but they were involved in propaganda, in black propaganda to a significant degree, and this was something that also involved cultivating ties with journalists in the United States. Not just abroad, but those who in some cases were working abroad, but might also be working in the U.S. And so the Washington Post is significant in this regard, yes, because of Philip Graham, and again his relationship to Wisner. It's important to keep in mind that the individuals who were being recruited by the CIA, individuals like Cord Meyer, were really at the top of their game. Allen Dulles was bringing people in from the Ivy League institutions, from Princeton and Yale and the like. And many of these people were liberal. If you look at Cord Meyer, he was a member of the Global Federalist Society or the International Federalist Society, and he was really a communist, more or less. I mean, he was certainly very far to the left, quite liberal, and when he was recruited into the CIA, he had this vision of having a world government, and they believed that they were doing this in order to prevent the next world war. And this was something that Lippmann actually championed in the early 1920s, having been a major high-level representative to the Wilson administration, or from the Wilson administration to the Paris Peace Conference following World War I, which established the League of Nations. If you read Lippmann's Public Opinion, which was published in 1922, it's really a very derisive take on U.S. public opinion, and there's this frustration in it that the Senate would not vote the United States into the it was the League of Nations, right? So what I'm getting at here is there's a kind of a parallel actually between individuals such as Walter Lippmann, who is very intellectual, who is very well read, who is at the top of his game as a journalist, as a public intellectual, and also an advisor, right, to the Wilson administration and the subsequent presidential administrations. He wants to really kind of further develop these ties between the U.S. and Britain. He wants to overcome any sort of animus that the United States may have towards foreign relations, such as with England following World War I. And you see similar types of sentiments being expressed by the likes of Cord Meyer, Elger Hiss, other individuals who were involved in the forging of the United Nations, which would provide the basis really for for a world government, at least the framework for something along those lines. And I think of those two kind of in the same sort of league, because they were both inspired by the writings of like Immanuel Kant, this idea of perpetual peace, this notion that in order for us to overcome war, and we have to have a one world government. They believed this, and they thought it was obviously there are many people who still do believe this, who hold this ideal very dear. In fact, as we speak, this is early September of 2015, and next week actually, there's going to be a major meeting of the United Nations, and one of the themes is world government. So by no means have these notions, these aspirations, they've not been laid to rest. And I think that they're important to acknowledge and to understand when we think about things such as the CIA and the media. So to get back to your question concerning the Washington Post, I kind of went off on that trajectory to a certain degree to point out that many of the individuals who were involved in the CIA were left of center, were liberal, if not socialist in their kind of political leanings in a certain way, certainly culturally, socially, whereas the FBI was somewhat more reactionary and more conservative, being under the auspices of J. Edgar Hoover, and more. They were in many ways also more circumspect in terms of communist or leftist influence in the United States on the media, on the arts, on culture, of course, right? This is epitomized by Joseph McCarthy, but McCarthy was not the only one. There was House Un-American Activities Committee. There was the FBI itself. Hoover, in many ways, really did have these types of these sorts of allegiances or motivations, and the CIA was, I guess, they did not quite have that to quite that degree. They thought of themselves in many ways as being the best and the brightest, and in some ways they were really. They came from the likes from the Ivy League, tremendously gifted. If you look at individuals such as E. Howard Hunt, Cord Meyer, these were the sorts of people that Dulles sought to recruit and to bring on, and so when you had the Washington Post brass, the editors coming together and having a soiree in Georgetown or elsewhere in the D.C. metropolitan area, you frequently had CIA personnel who were rubbing elbows with the editorial staff. And individuals such as Phil Gramm, and there was this was just something that was perceived as being natural. But there's no doubt that there's a great deal of information that was exchanged, and there was just a general sort of sentiment. There was kind of a zeitgeist at that time that the U.S. was in the Cold War, specifically against the Soviet Union, and if someone came to a journalist who was working abroad to divulge information on where they had been, the given countries they had visited, what the sentiment on the street was, what sorts of views and opinions certain members of state they may have interviewed may have had. This was regarded as being kind of one's patriotic duty. And that ran from the journalists and the stringers all the way up to the publishers, all the way up to the likes of Philip Graham or Sulzberger or Henry Luce or William Sarnoff or any of these individuals that were involved in the media at the time, particularly in the 1950s and in the 1960s. And this is something that's discussed by Deborah Davis in her book. I cite that. There are a handful of other authors as well, political scientists and historians that have treated this. But I think some of the earliest and best work have been done by independent authors and journalists.
And you have the Congress of Cultural Freedom. I think there is a book written by Francis Stoner Saunders about the Cultural Cold War. And this involves I guess you could say I wouldn't say overt, but the direct relationship between CIA and its funding of various journals and magazines and cultural events. And this was primarily overseas, but apparently it also involved like promoting Ms. Magazine, which is goes down as feminist magazine. And some say even Playboy and National Review magazine, because of William F. Buckley's connections to CIA, who he had worked for Howard Hunt in Mexico. And so it was a very broad and ambitious program, apparently, that was instituted by the intelligence agencies to sort of create certain narratives and create this false impression of political opposition, left-right, this left-right narrative that we're given, and this idea of controlled opposition was established. It wasn't just newspapers, but you also mentioned the sort of the cultural milieu, if you will, where these guys went to the same, they belonged to the same secret societies or fraternities. They go to the same parties, cocktail, parties, and they talk, rub elbows. So there is no adversarial relationship here. There's no fourth estate holding the government, keeping the government honest, holding their feet to the fire, asking the tough questions. They're all on the same team. So it's not something that's conducive to an adversarial, investigative press, right? I mean,
absolutely.
Yeah.
You mentioned the likes of William Buckley and the Ms. Magazine publisher
Steinem.
Yeah,
Steinem.
Yeah, these are change agents. These are leaders of public opinion. It may be, conservative public opinion or liberal left public opinion, but they're funded and they're backed in part because they do provide this, as you point out, that there is this left-right paradigm, and they tend to galvanize that. And if they can lead public opinion one way or another, they'll do that. There's also, I think that probably a litmus test in this regard is looking at these major public events. These, Peter Dale Scott terms them deep events. So if you look at the Kennedy assassination, to what degree was the press actually effective in delving into that to any significant degree? They didn't. In fact, they were actually involved in propagandizing, in pushing the official narrative of that event. And this is also the case with the left or the liberal media, the likes of the Nation, the progressive journalists like I.F. Stone. They turn tail and run. Intellectuals like Noam Chomsky, they would not look at that particular event, even though it's one of the most important events of the century. certainly the most important event in the past, one of the most important events of the past half century since World War II, and yet it's not something that is deemed to be fair game for journalists, whether it's conventional journalists or even those in the so-called alternative media.
And this failure to investigate this isn't a function of their cozy relationship with the establishment, whether it's CIA or the corporate interests that the CIA actually represents. It's not the fact that that they're lazy or there's a hive mentality. You'd say there's more. The failure to investigate these things is more of an operational relationship, meaning they're directed not to, and they're directed to misdirect the public in this regard.
Well, the way that a newsroom or a news organization works is, I think that at the bottom rung or the lower rungs of the ladder, you do have journalists that do want to, they want to delve into significant material, and they want to do good work. You have a few rungs up, you have management. And they're closer to the owners, of course, than the journalists themselves. Mm-hmm. And so they can provide incentives or disincentives to pursue one story versus another. And we actually saw this. In fact, this was something that I cited specifically in the article about the New York Times in the late 1960s actually beginning to open up an investigation of the Kennedy assassination. And there were, at the time, a number of prominent newspapers and periodicals that were calling for a reopening of an investigation because the Warren Commission had received so much criticism from so many quarters. This is just couple of years after it had been released, and so this was in late 1966, and the journalists themselves were actually called off the particular story, even though they point out that they had gotten a number of good leads. And whenever that happened, they seemed to be called off that story and put on another assignment. That, I think, is number 27 in the article that they're discussing, the CIA and the media. But the journalist says, I'd be off on a good lead and then somebody'd call me off and send me out to California on another story or something. We never really detached anyone for this. We weren't really serious. And so, again, I can't, one would be painting with a fairly broad brush if they were to say, it's sort of a monolithic thing where all the journalists are in on it. That's obviously not true. But what I attempt to kind of illustrate in the article, and what has more or less been revealed in the work that I've done on this, is that you do have certainly the higher ups, the management, the owners, in many cases, who are on the same page or who are aware. It's kind of like a pyramid structure, and then those who are most of those who are actually journalists are less aware of this. And now think about the fact that with the consolidation of the news media, 90% of what we see, what we hear, what we read comes from 5 or 6 corporations. And back in the early 1980s, it was 10 times that. It was 50 or so companies. And so what I'm getting at is that control, the degree of control over the content, and also the ability to be able to actually push a particular story wall to wall, is much more concentrated. Those levers are much fewer. They're in the hands of a select few, far fewer than was the case in the just 30, 35 years ago. And that's not to say that the news media were controlled by the masses or anything
yeah.
at that time. Certainly not the case. It's to a large degree been controlled by fairly powerful interests, at least the mainstream media. So yeah, there's one more thing I was going to mention, and now it's slipped my mind. Perhaps it'll come back to me.
Well, a good example of this relationship, and it may not be immediate because you have this concept of the limited hangout in the press, where the press appears to be doing its job, but it's really doing a cover-up. And I'm not sure how familiar you are with the intrigues of the Watergate story and some of the, the speculations or theorizing what really went down with Watergate. Of course, the Washington Post played a big role in that. In fact, it's kind of made its name with taking down Richard Nixon with the Watergate scandal. But one can't suspect something when you take into consideration the Post's relationship with the intelligence agencies and Nixon's conflict with Richard Helms at the time, and how so many people who were central to Nixon's downfall had ties to the intelligence community. And some people thought that what it was an attempt to take down Nixon. I guess they've graduated from killing presidents just to getting them to resign, which you could argue is an improvement, I guess. But it's that's one example, because you have, I think Bob Woodward goes back to naval intelligence. I think
that's right. Yeah.
Leon Jaworski had connections to the intelligence agency, and was it Butterfield, Alexander Butterfield, who leaked the idea of the taping system?
Mm-hmm.
And I think he had ties to the intelligence agency, and he just let that out for no particular reason at the Watergate. When Sen Irvin was sitting there lazily asking questions, so, there's a recording system? So one has to wonder. And some of that goes back to Nixon's conflict with Dick Helms and his demanding the files on what Nixon referred to as the Bay of Pigs thing, which really meant the Kennedy assassination.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's another example how you can. And of course, Ben Bradley, which I didn't know until fairly recently, had worked for the CIA in Europe.
Yes.
So there you go. Good example, just that connection there. But I guess, Watergate is a whole other story to Watergate, and we weren't really given the full. Woodward and Bernstein did not break the case on that. And
well, no, but the popular mythology is that was the free press's finest hour.
Mm-hmm.
So,
and the whole, I think it was Fletcher Prouty who talked about the Pentagon Papers, something that the New York Times and the Post played a big role in, how that itself might have been an operation, a limited hangout to pretty much pass the blame from the CIA to the Pentagon regarding Vietnam, because.
Yeah, I think that Prouty also points out that there really wasn't anything that revelatory in the Pentagon Papers.
Yeah, because if you've been reading Le Monde or some foreign newspapers, any informed person kind of knew what was going on, which is kind of reminiscent of the current whistleblowers, with WikiLeaks and what's his name, the NSA guy in Russia now. His name fails me now.
Oh, Snowden.
Snowden, which anyone who's familiar with some of the other whistleblowers that didn't get any attention, what's his name? That other NSA guy, Bill. Name's failing me now. But there've been a number of whistleblowers who've come out with much worse information have not gotten any coverage. Bill Binney, I'm sorry, Bill Binney was his name. Mm-hmm. Bill Binney. Mm-hmm. And so that's another example of this. Another example maybe of a limited hangout thing where it's really they're not revealing too much, but that it's telling the partial truth is that is a lot.
Some people are put on a pedestal, and other people are ignored.
Yeah, so that's another angle to consider.
You really have to call into question WikiLeaks itself, given the fact that they were that WikiLeaks and Assange were the red carpet was rolled out for them, by the New York Times and the Guardian, and so you really have to somewhat question that. It's not to say that they don't put out material that might be somewhat revealing, but at the same time, Assange's background itself is something that is questionable, and I could say the same for Snowden.
Yeah.
I think one of the few people that's actually delved into the background of Snowden is John Rappaport.
Yeah.
It's largely been lost on pretty much everyone else. But how is it that this guy got such high degree of security clearance to get the information that he did? Say the same thing with Bradley Manning, or it's Chelsea Manning now. How is it that this fairly low-level grunt was able to get the amount of material that they actually did? Now, why aren't these questions really asked? Well, it goes back to really a lack of understanding of how government and how government agencies work. And there's also a great deal of internecine fighting too between government agencies.
Yeah, that could be the whole. I think Rappaport's theory is that it's a Langley's operation against NSA.
Yeah.
And that's because that's his theory on that.
His NSA is much more technologically savvy and the like. Yeah, and I think also with the Pentagon Papers, I think that's something that to a significant degree kind of lit Nixon's fuse. He was already somewhat paranoid, somewhat alcoholic. He had already done a fairly good job of isolating himself from the press, from potential contacts, from potential allies. And so, I think that the instance, the release of those documents somewhat exacerbated that and hastened his downfall.
And also it led to the ascendancy of Nelson Rockefeller.
Yes, that's right.
And of course, then right after that, there are two shots taken at Gerald Ford.
Yeah.
And coincidence.
Unfortunately, Rockefeller never got a chance to ascend to the presidency. But Rockefeller has an interesting background too. Mm-hmm. In fact, that goes back quite some time to his days, I believe, at Dartmouth.
And another ascendancy led to was the Bush family. And that's another dimension to the Watergate affair, how Bush played a role in that. And that goes back to Nixon's relationship with Prescott Bush, and how Prescott Bush was kind of Nixon's political godfather. He's the one that hired him to run for Congress. And what happened with the Bushes is George H.W. Bush was recruited by Allen Dulles, some say as a way for Dulles to get control or get out from under the heel of Prescott Bush, who was more or less his superior at that time, when the intelligence agencies, the whole intelligence community was forming in the late 40s. And Prescott Bush, at least according to like Russ Baker, and was involved with intelligence, before the war and during the war. Mm-hmm. And of course, in Prescott Bush's involvement with the union banking and he started the USO. Some people think the USO was a sort of an intelligence operation as well, which isn't too surprising.
And also the Bushes were they were financial advisors for the Harriman family.
That's right, Brown Brother Harriman. That's right.
Yeah, and a lot of this, you bring this up. It's a good point because much of the intelligence community's dealings are based on Wall Street. Mm-hmm. You have to keep in mind that the Dulles brothers, for example, were Wall Street attorneys as well, and that the CIA in part was established to serve the interests of the elite, the less than 1%. And one of the ways that they're able to perpetuate their activities is through the trade in illegal drugs. Mm-hmm. It's been the case, at least since the 1960s.
Yeah, of course, the connection to narcotics, that goes back even to the days of the British Empire and the Opium Wars, and the British East India Company. And of course, the British East India Company, a man named Yale, he endowed Yale University. He worked for the British India Company.
That's right, yeah.
And so even the name there goes back to opium. And of course, they have Skull and Bones and the Russell Trust and the Clipper ships and all the financial interests that grew out of that. And of course, with Dulles brothers, you get this corporatist mentality because both of them represented United Fruit, and the big oil companies. Of course, the two primary regime change operations in the agency's history was Iran in 1953 and Arbenz in 54. Mm-hmm. And those were done for the direct benefit of oil companies and the United Fruit Company. I think United Fruit Company is a particularly interesting case because I think in that case, Allen Dulles was a stockholder, a board member, and his brother was John Foster Dulles was the lawyer for United Fruit. And they both were, Secretary of State and Director of the Central Intelligence Agencies, respectively. So, yeah. That's just an obvious example, how that relationship works. The ties between Wall Street, the intelligence agencies, and the banking industries and all that's all connected. Big, corporations and all that.
Well, it is a way to bypass the traditional institutions that purport to be democratic. Mm-hmm. You don't have to worry about getting a declaration of war passed if you have your own army, more or less, which is what the CIA and these other agencies function as.
Now, another angle to this, we're talking about the media and the news and the way the mainstream press is co-opted and controlled, and how you talk about how this may inhibit or prevent them from investigating some of these other deep events. Because obviously, if these are deep events, and I do think they are, they're going to be involved, if not in the action, in the operation itself, but in the cover-up, because they're not going to do that. They're not going to ask the right questions, and if you don't ask the right questions, you don't have to worry about the answers. This would suggest infiltration, and I think we have enough examples of that throughout history of these of the press being directly. One thing that you get in the article is also the relationship beyond the news. It gets into entertainment, music, and movies. I know the CIA has a liaison office with Hollywood, and that's overt. But there's probably deeper connections to it because of the product that comes out of Hollywood. Many have written about characters like Chase Brandon with Hollywood, and also the Pentagon too. Often reviews scripts as a condition to letting them have access to military equipment. So these movies, the scripts, what the movies are about, and the narrative in these movies are heavily determined by the interest of these intelligence agencies. Correct?
Yeah. Well, and the military had been doing that for years. In exchange for equipment and so forth that they could use in the films, they would ask to vet the script. And during wartime or during the Cold War, this was just more or less a reflex of the studios, because they wanted to be patriotic, just the same idea as I mentioned earlier with to journalists readily cooperating with the CIA and divulging information, or somehow being an asset. But when you look at films like Argo or Zero Dark 30, I mean, this is sophisticated propaganda. It's even more than that in many ways. It's kind of it aids in the rewriting of history, because some people are not that well versed or nuanced in terms of their historical perspectives, and so they might rely to a significant degree on films such as this to develop an understanding of Iran, or to develop an understanding of 9/11 and the so-called War on Terror, even though many of the depictions in these films are blatantly false. This is something that can be quite easily demonstrated. But nevertheless, you do have agencies, including the CIA, that are behind the screenplays, or are involved in informing those in various ways, as well as vehicles that will paint or place the agency in a positive light. And I cite just one kind of glimpse of that. And there's a book that was published by Tricia Jenkins on the CIA in Hollywood, how the agency shapes film. and television that came out a couple of years ago. I think University of Texas Press. But that's important work. Because so few people actually are aware of the extent to which these sorts of hidden interests actually influence culture and information and what we take in and what we believe to be in many cases valid and something that we can act upon or at least base our beliefs or our assumptions on.
And some people have speculated, the development or course of music has been heavily influenced. Some have connected the marketing of rap music to the foundations and intelligence agencies as a form of cultural or psychological warfare. Of course, you have Dave McGowan's work, who did regarding the Larricanian scene of the '60s and the counterculture, how much of the counterculture was manufactured, if not manufactured, manipulated by these very interests. So it's not as spontaneous as we think it is. It is a form of psychological warfare. With the movies, get your opinion. In the movies, there seemed to be a period of time in the 1970s when movies were getting, movies like 3 Days of the Condor. They were kind of getting very critical. They seem to be, their portrayal of the agencies and the powers that be were rather cutting. But then the reins should be pulled in the 80s. Would you agree to that? There should be some sort of crackdown in the 80s, at least creatively in Hollywood?
Well, in the 1970s, there was kind of an opening, and there was a criticism, increased sort of criticism and scrutiny of government, and in part due to Watergate and the downfall of the Nixon administration. Suddenly, it became actually possible to consider the fallibility of our leaders and our institutions, right? Imagine that. Mm-hmm. But many people really revered the United States institutions. I mean, I'm talking about Americans specifically up until the early to mid 1970s. Then there's the church committee hearings and that episode where you actually had the agencies that were made up of what we thought to be the best and the brightest and those that had our best interest at heart, and were out fighting the evil Soviets and the Chi-Coms. They were coming under scrutiny. And so I think this in part was reflected in popular culture, as you point out. And then this changed to a certain degree with the election of Reagan.
Yeah, unfortunately, a lot of people from the conservative end equated the economic troubles of the 70s, the malaise, the inflation, with criticism of government, which is kind of a contradictory, there's kind of a contradiction there, because ordinarily you think people conservative are skeptical of politics and big government. But when it came to Reagan, they rallied around big government, particularly in terms of military expansion, things like that. And so when they take that time and they equate the criticism, sort of the general feeling of the late 70s, with that criticism. And so by the 80s, you had these feel-good movies, and whether it's, about the military or the Chuck Norris type movies,
Rambo,
and the real victims of the Vietnam War were Top Gun, yeah. And so it's kind of I guess that's how that's how propaganda works. I guess it plays with your mind. So
George H.W. Bush in 1991, as you recall, after the first Gulf War, he said, we've kicked the Vietnam syndrome.
Yeah.
And I think that was part of the objective of that in the 1980s, at least through popular culture, was to sort of reinstill this patriotism, as empty as it might be, in the American public.
If you weren't going abroad and blowing up some third world country, you weren't patriotic, I guess, and it was a sign of weakness. if you weren't invading some poor country,
right?
6,000 miles away.
Yeah, and since Vietnam, at least, look at the sort of reputation, the degree to which it's been sullied by that type of foreign policy. So it's almost as if someone was attempting to undermine the United States, because the U.S. actually should be a force for good.
Yeah.
But it's gone abroad, and it's created such havoc, and it's done so in such a duplicitous and nasty way in every instance. Perhaps it's time that we have our comeuppance. And just recently, John Kerry has said that if we don't get this deal with Iran, the U.S. dollar is dead. It may very well be already, and that's terribly unfortunate. But we haven't even gotten into the whole financial aspect of this. We did do a little bit. We did a bit, but underlying all of this, I think, is the significance of central banking, and the fact that the U.S. has had the most important and influential central bank, which is the Federal Reserve. And so a lot of these, one could look at, say, the cause of war as being, this event or that event, and this is generally what conventional history does. But if you look at the fact that I don't think it's coincidental that the Federal Reserve was established in 1913, and in 1914 the World War I began, and 1917 the United States was involved in World War I, and this has to do with the getting nations in debt, and I think that's one of the reasons that the 20th century has seen so many wars and has seen such a degree of foreign intervention by the United States. And you have, the development of NATO, and all of these things tend to benefit the central banking system itself.
And the central bank system is the enabler because it creates the credit.
Yes, exactly.
And the inflation, which finances these things. And, of course, the fact that the dollar is perched as the world reserve currency opens up a vast pool of credit to the federal government. And that it's this debt cycle that they've created. And that you pointing to debt, it's a good point, because through perpetual debt, the people at the top are amassing more wealth and concentrating more power with each successive generation.
But if there are, of course, other explanations one might look to. For example, if we were Freudians, we would be able to argue that, oh well, it's the dark recesses of the human psyche that is the cause of these wars. It has nothing to do with the greed and the lust for power of central bankers.
Well, I think it was H.L. Mencken who said that wars are not planned by common men scratching out a living. They're made by princes infesting palaces.
That's very good.
Well, James, I kept you on a little longer than I said I would for a few minutes, so I'm going to let you go. I want to thank you for coming on tonight to discuss these things, and hopefully I can invite you back sometime in the future. If you'd be back, that'd be great. We just scratched the surface on this topic. That's all we can do. All I can say is go read the article, The CIA and the Media, 50 Facts the World Needs to Know. It's at Global Research. And you can see James' work at the Memory Hole blog and catch his show, which is Realpolitik. It's carried on Truth Frequency Radio. And anything else you want to say before we close out tonight?
No, I think you've covered it. And thanks, Tim. I appreciate being on.
Well, thank you for coming on tonight. Good night.
Okay, good night. Thanks.